Hi everyone. Today I'm going to take you through a history of photography. It's very my look at photography is going to be very brief, but I want to show you some iconic photographs that show how we got from one photograph 180 years ago to the 95 million photographs that are uploaded to Instagram every day. Most of you, or all of you, are too young to remember this incident, the fatal shooting of John Lennon in 1980. And yet, many of you may recognize this photograph of his glasses. These glasses were the iconic glasses that John Lennon wore, and they were so closely associated with him that people recognized him by his glasses. After he was shot, his wife, Yoko Ono, kept the glasses to represent the violence of guns. And she posted this tweet with the photograph. Over 1,057,000 people have been killed by guns in the USA since John Lennon was shot and killed in December 8th, 1980. Photography is one of the most powerful ways of communicating. Truly, pictures are worth 1,000 words. Photos have brought about changes in policy. We have photographs to thank for the establishment of the national parks. They have afflicted the comfortable and comforted the afflicted. We have photographs to thank for the end of child labor in this country, for seeing the effects of the Depression on migrant workers. They've also entertained people. They've given us the inside picture of the rich and famous, and they've spotlighted news events. Thousands of photographs every day are posted to news sites of what's going on in the news. The photographs I'm going to show you today are taken from Time Magazine's borrowed from Time Magazine's most influential images of all time, and I'll provide a link for that in Blackboard. So if you would like to sit and spend some time going through the 100 photographs that Time Magazine has selected and posted, you may do so. Each photo comes with a story about why the photo is significant, and there are just some amazing, remarkable photos in that collection. I'm going to start with the first photograph. This photograph was taken in 1827 using by Joseph Nicephore Niepce using a camera called the camera Obscura. That was the very first camera. He shot this of the roof lines in Paris. You'll notice that in this photograph we see light on both the left and the right sides of the photograph, which of course would not occur in nature. We wouldn't see light on a building both in the east and the west. And the reason that that's present in this photograph is because Niepce had to expose this photo for 8 hours to be able to fix the photo image. How does a camera obscura work? A camera obscura is also referred to as a pinhole camera. If you go into a dark room on a bright day and make a hole in a dark window covering, or in this case, a box. Sometimes you may have done this in high school. People will use those large food cans. And like magic, you would see the scene on the other side of the pinhole projected upside down on a wall or the other side of the camera. Niepce used the camera obscura to project the image on a sheet of pewter coated with a material that permanently fixed the image to the sheet. And of course, he used natural light. There wasn't electricity then to expose the image, so that it illuminated both sides of the courtyard. 10 years later, Louis Daguerre developed the first camera that could shoot clear photos, and these photos were called daguerrotypes. The image from the camera would form on a plate of iodized silver that was developed by and made visible by exposing that silver to mercury vapor. Now, as you might imagine, this was not very good for the health of photographers. Mercury vapor is highly toxic. However, it created beautiful images. These images are very fragile, but you can still see daguerrotypes today. The Nelson Atkins Museum has a display of daguerrotypes. And you really can't, because they're so reflective, you can't see them very well in natural light, and they're best seen when you're looking at them through in a dark environment, so that the light reflected on them does not obscure the image. Moving forward to 1865, we have a significant photo shot by Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady is considered the father of photojournalism, and he was best known for his portraits and documentation of the Civil War. Now, because cameras at that time could not capture live action, to capture live action, you need a camera, even as your phone, with a very fast shutter speed. That's the only way you can freeze action. So because these cameras did not have fast shutters, the only way to shoot photographs was to shoot photographs of subjects that weren't moving. So in this case, what you see in the photographs of the Civil War is you see a lot of dead soldiers. Now, the photo ethics of the time, photo ethics developed after this time. And so what photographers would do then, which you can't do now without crossing all kinds of ethical boundaries, is that photographers would arrange the subjects. And in this case, he placed a gun on top of the soldier. That gun would not have fallen in that position when the soldier died. This photograph, taken in 1904, is significant because it represents a movement in photography called pictorialism. You ask yourself, is this a photograph or is this a piece of art? That was Steichen's point. In the early 1900s, the first commercial cameras were available to the public. And so professional photographers wanted to be able to differentiate their work from the snapshots taken by consumers with handheld cameras. So in the case of this photograph, Moonlight, Steichen took the photograph of this scene in the woods in a pond in Mamaroneck, New York. And then he took the image and he hand colored the black and white prints with blue tones. And he might have even added that moon, although history does not record whether he actually did that. The blurring of these two mediums was important to photography, because after this point, photographers who wanted to add meaning to scenic photography would often alter the images, paint them, color them, to blur the lines between art and photojournalism. This photograph was shot by Louis Hine, Cotton Mill Girl. Louis Hine was an American photographer, and for him, the camera was both a research tool and an instrument of social reform. In 1908, he became a photographer for the National Child Labor Committee, and over the next decade, he documented child labor in American industry to help the National Child Labor Committee in its lobbying efforts to end the practice of child labor. He was also a freelance photographer for The Survey, a leading social reform magazine, and he took all these pictures to show the country the cruelties of child labor. In the case of a cotton mill milling cotton was extremely dangerous work, and you could get your arm caught in the mill and lose an arm. And another, and Hine also photographed boys working in coal mines. Mining was also a very dangerous job, and young boys, because they were small, were perfect workers for coal mines. And the work was extremely dangerous, and of course these children were inhaling coal dust, which would eventually give many of them black lung and cause premature death. Because of these photographs, these photographs of the photographs that Hine took largely contributed to the passage of the Child Welfare Act in 1925. The Child Welfare Act was not a one-and-done deal. Child labor was not outlawed completely at that time. It took many years before businesses had to stop employing children in their manufacturing. This photograph, taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, a photographer whom you may have heard of, in 1932. Speed and instinct were at the heart of Cartier-Bresson's brilliance as a photographer. And never did he combine the two as well as he did in this photograph that he took in 1932, when he pointed his Leica camera at a fence behind Paris's Saint-Lazare train station. The resulting image is a masterpiece of form and light. So let's look at this picture. This man is leaping across the water. We see his reflection and his legs parted. His image very much mirrors the image of dancers in this poster that you see here. Also, you see these ripples in the water from him leaping off this wooden ladder, how the shapes of this water mirror these pieces of wood or metal in the water. Cartier-Bresson referred to this as a decisive moment. And that was his term for the ability to immortalize a fleeting scene on film. And it was a fast, mobile, detail-obsessed style that would help chart the course for modern photography and putting movement in photography. This photo was taken by Margaret Bourke White of Fort Peck Dam in 1936. Margaret Bourke White was a remarkable photographer in her own right, but also partly remarkable because there were few female photographers shooting at this time. This photograph appeared in Fortune magazine. Margaret Bourke White shot many photographs over the years for Fortune. This photo reflects a style of photography. This photo reflects a style of art called constructivism. It was a style of art that was practiced by Russian artists, and it showed repetition. The dam itself actually is a precursor to a kind of architecture referred to as brutalism. And brutalist architecture is as it sounds. In fact, Wesco is sort of a failed experiment in brutalist architecture, and you can perhaps see some similar forms here. Margaret Bourke White also was well known because she was the first female photographer allowed to go behind enemy lines in World War II and shoot in a combat zone. Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. I would imagine that all of you recognize this photograph. It's one of the most famous photographs that documents the effects of the Depression. She was shooting, she was in California shooting homeless pea pickers in a camp. And she was part of an army of photographers that the US government set out to document images after the Depression, document the effect of the Depression. It was called the Works Progress Administration. This photograph revealed to Americans the suffering of migrant workers. But there are a few other interesting things about this photograph. Just looking at the composition of the photo, we see her very worried face. This woman was 35 when this photograph was taken. We see her children with their faces turned away from the camera and a baby cradled in her arms. Dorothea Lange, she didn't just shoot one picture, and Eric and I keep talking about how when you're shooting your photo narrative, the need to take many different images to find the right image. She shot photos from many different distances. She's got photographs. If you look up Dorothea Lange, Migrant Mother, you'll find other images on the internet that show, for example, her farther back with her and her children underneath this tent. There are photographs of her with different expressions, but this is the photograph she chose because of the focus on the mother's face. Now, while she did not alter this photograph, as you might in Photoshop, I want to make an important point about this. She cropped the image, and cropping an image has a very powerful influence because you're changing the framing, and when you change the framing, you are making an editorial decision about the photograph. Something else, the woman in this photo, while the photograph made Dorothea Lange famous, the woman in this photo never received any kind of financial benefit from the photograph, and she was bitter for the rest of her life about that. Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams was an American photographer. He was an environmentalist, and he is best known for his black and white landscape photographs of the American West, particularly of Yosemite. Now, this is not Yosemite. This is Joshua Tree National Monument. I happen to be partial to this photograph, which is why I'm including it. This image, you'll notice the clarity of this image, how it almost looks hyper-real. Well, that was one of the hallmarks of Ansel Adams' landscape photography, and he achieved that clarity by using what's referred to as a large format camera. The cameras that he used, the film in those cameras was typically either 4 by 5 inches or 8 by 10 inches. When you enlarge a photo, the larger you make it, the more detail you lose in the image. So if you start with a very small film negative and you try to enlarge it to the monumental sizes of the photographs of Ansel Adams photos, you're going to not be able to capture the detail of the image. So by starting with a larger piece of film, you're enlarging it maybe 20 times instead of 120 times. And so that enabled Ansel Adams to retain the detail of the photograph. He also used some photographic processing techniques that heightened the detail in his photos. His photos are very expensive. I was in a gallery in Santa Fe and saw some large format prints from Ansel Adams that were selling for around $100,000. Robert Capa was the only still photographer to wade in with the 34,250 troops that landed on Omaha Beach during D-Day. His photographs are infused with jarring movement, his photographs from that day are infused with jarring movement from that brutal assault. And it gave the public an American soldier's view of the dangers of war. Capa spent an hour and a half under fire as men around him died. Thousands of men around him died. Robert Capa coined the phrase, "If your photos aren't good enough, it's because you're not close enough." And that's a mantra that photographers live by today, especially if they're going into combat situations. They put themselves in harm's way to try to capture images that will move the American public. Interestingly, in World War II, photographers were allowed to embed with troops, and that also happened in Vietnam, and I will show you a picture from Vietnam, and I will talk a little bit more about that. I've talked about this photograph quite a bit with my students in our in-person meeting. This photograph shot by Robert Frank called Trolley, New Orleans, 1955. Robert Frank was a Swiss photographer, and he came to America to shoot photographs of Americans for a book called The Americans. The book was not critically well received in America because critics thought that he was trying to show America in a bad light. And he felt that, and critics felt that this misrepresented America. But he was shooting America as he saw it. And the photos that he shot were real photos of real people in their moments. This photograph, among the beautiful things about this photograph is its use of framing. And the frames are serendipitous because of the dividers in the trolley. And yet what you have is a series of individual frames of people, and each one of those frames reveals something else about the people. We have the man at the far left who's behind glass, and you can see all of these people are looking at Robert Frank. They're looking at the photographer and reacting to him. So this man who is obscured by the glass looks unhappy. The woman looks angry. The children, this boy is focused directly, making eye contact with the photographer. And then we have the two African Americans segregated at the back of the trolley, and the face of this very tired man with his hand dangling out the window and the very bright white buttons on his shirt. And then we have the woman at the back, and she's the only woman who's not looking at the photographer, or only subject not looking at the photographer, and she looks the happiest of all of these people. She's wearing an outfit that tells us that she is some kind of, she might be a housekeeper, or perhaps she's the nanny of the children, but she can't sit with them because of segregation. And then there are the reflections, which we can't really see, but it appears there are people in them above that shows that there's activity happening behind Robert Frank. In the 1950s, Richard Avedon was perhaps the world's most famous fashion photographer. He shot for a magazine called Harper's Bazaar. He also shot photographs for Vogue. And Dovima, the model in this photograph, was the most famous fashion model in the world at that time. Before Avedon shot this photograph, models were mannequins. They stood still with wearing clothes. But what Avedon did that had never been done before is he took the model out of the studio and set her in a real scene where there was activity and motion. The fact that this picture brings movement to a medium that was typified by stillness before, that changed the course of American fashion photography. And this photograph blurred the lines between fashion photography and art. Charles Moore was a photographer for Life magazine. And this photograph resonates still, especially today. But it was shot in 1963 during the Civil Rights Movement. Charles Moore was a white native Alabaman, and he was the son of a Baptist preacher, and he was appalled by the violence inflicted on African Americans in the name of law and order. It was Moore's image of a police dog tearing into the pants of a worn by a black protester that captured just the routine, everyday violence inflicted against African Americans and the brutality of segregation. You see this woman here reacting. You see these photographers, white photographers in the background just shooting pictures. And the expression on this policeman's face is one that is almost of a kind of pleasure or trying to get the job done. Thanks to this photograph, which got, and many like it, but this one in particular, which got legislators' attention, the Civil Rights Act was passed a year later in 1964. You may have seen this photo. This photo was taken at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio in 1970. In 1970, the Vietnam War was moving into Cambodia, which was a neutral country. And the incursion into Cambodia upset many young people. And so protests erupted across the United States against this incursion into Cambodia. For a number of days in Kent, Ohio, protests had been building. And on this day, or prior to this day, the mayor and the chief of police in Kent State decided to call out the National Guard to help restore order. National Guard were brought in to the campus. And in the space of 13 seconds, the National Guard wounded 9 people and killed 4 students. John Philo, who shot this photograph, was a student photographer, and he was also a part-time news photographer, and he captured Marianne Vecchio's crying out and kneeling over the fatally wounded Jeffrey Miller. This photograph went on to win the Pulitzer Prize and has since become a visual symbol of a hopeful nation's lost youth. This photograph was taken during the Vietnam War, also during the time that Vietnam War was moving into Cambodia. Nick Ut, the photographer, was 21 years old when he took this photograph of Kim Phuc. He is now, he may be retired now, but at the time he was an Associated Press photographer. During the Vietnam War, U.S. troops were allied with South Vietnamese, and South Vietnam was trying to get independence from North Vietnam, which wanted to make the entire country of Vietnam a communist country. South Vietnamese, who were our allies, flew over what they thought were North Vietnamese, but weren't, in fact, and dropped napalm. Napalm was a chemical weapon, and it was primarily used to destroy foliage. Vietnam is a jungle, a country with a lot of jungle that obscured troops. So the military would go in and use napalm and also Agent Orange to destroy the jungle so that it would expose the North Vietnamese. In this photo, we see this girl. Her clothes have been essentially blown off of her by napalm. She's screaming in pain because she was horribly scarred and burned. The napalm burned her back. And in years later, she ended up moving to Canada And there was you can find information about her online and see photographs of her today. But a plastic surgeon in Florida did a lot of work on her scars to try to revise them, because scar tissue contracts over time and can be very painful. Nick won the Pulitzer Prize for this photograph, but it was rarely shown in American newspapers because American newspapers feared it was too graphic. The image was one that was published years after the Vietnam War. But photographs of the Vietnam War turned the tide of American sentiment against the war. At this point, as with World War II, photographers were allowed to embed with soldiers, with the troops, and shoot photos as the war was happening. Because of the impact of these photographs on American attitudes toward Vietnam and the Vietnamese War, in future wars, and in Kuwait, when Bush sent troops into Kuwait, they did not allow photographers to embed because they did not want those photographs. They did not want photographs published in American newspapers that would turn American sentiment against the efforts in Kuwait. James Nachtwey is considered one of the top 50 photographers in the world. His specialty is shooting conflict or the effects of conflict on people more than it was to go into a war situation and shoot combat. In the early 90s, famine was used in Somalia, and starvation has been used throughout history as a way of subduing people. He could not find funding in America to send him to Somalia to photograph the effects of famine. So he paid his own way to Somalia, and then he got support by the American Red Cross, by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And he brought back a cache of haunting images, including the scene of a woman who's waiting to be taken to a feeding center in a wheelbarrow. She was too weak to walk. This photograph was published as part of a cover feature in the New York Times Magazine. And the result of having this photograph published was millions and millions of dollars then being donated and directed to the International Red Cross to help ease the famine in Somalia. This photograph, Falling Man, I'm recording this lecture on September 11th, so it's especially moving and hard for me to look at today. Most of you were too young. You weren't even born during September 11th. You've doubtless heard your parents talk about it and other people you know who were older. When the planes flew into the Twin Towers and caught them on fire, people were trapped. And so many people chose to exit the building by leaping out of it. This photograph, Falling Man, is one of the only widely seen pictures that shows someone who is dying. It was published in the days after 9/11. This photograph was published in many newspapers around the US, but the backlash from readers, it was so upsetting to readers that it was pushed into temporary obscurity. It's a difficult image to process. I mean, this man seems to be perfectly bisecting the towers as he darts toward the earth like an arrow. Falling Man's identity is still unknown. A writer and reporter for Esquire did a story, and he tried to identify Falling Man through the clothes he was wearing and other things that were visible in the image. And he tried to identify Falling Man through the clothes he was wearing and other things that were visible in the image. And the visible in the image. And he never was able to identify this person. The most they know about him is that he likely was working in food service. He's wearing the black pants. He was perhaps working in the kitchen at the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center called Windows of the World. And finally is a photograph taken by Pete Souza. Pete Souza was President Obama's chief White House photographer. He was also a photographer for Ronald Reagan. He was in the Situation Room as the U.S. forces raided Osama bin Laden's Pakistan compound and the terrorist leader was killed. Notice that this photograph does not show the raid. What it shows are the people who are watching the raid as it's unfolding. We see the drawn face of President Obama. We see the concerned face of now presidential candidate Biden. And we see Hillary Clinton's face and the shock with her hand over her mouth. Seeing the expressions on these people, he was unable, of course, to photograph he was unable to photograph the raid itself, but showing the faces of these people, it was an extremely tense moment and in a very scary decision for the president to have to make to send in troops, in this case Navy SEALs, to kill Osama bin Laden, whom they've been tracking for many years. They had been tracking him for 10 years after the Twin Towers fell. The White House photographer's job is to photograph history. Pete, as President Obama's chief White House photographer, shot around 3 million photographs. And he was everywhere that the president was while he was working, and even sometimes while he wasn't working. He would go to Hawaii when the president went on vacation and shoot photographs there. And these photographs are in the White House archive. A presidential photographer is a historian, but the work of the presidential photographer also tells a story of a presidency. The first presidential photographer went to work for John F. Kennedy. And every president since has had a chief White House photographer. Two of those photographers or presidents have not allowed a lot of access to the photos, or maybe even to the photographers' work and photographs of their work. And those two presidents were Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. And I'll end by telling you that there's a documentary about the work of Pete Souza called The Way I See It, and that will be in theaters on September 18th.